Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a feature-rich SwiftUI WebView using the new SwiftUI WebKit WebView with a simple URL argument. From entering and validating URLs to adding navigation gestures, magnification, link previews, and even a scroll-to-top button. This video has you covered. By the end of this video, you'll have learned the ins and outs of the new SwiftUI WebKit and specifically the WebView with the URL argument. In the process, we'll build a simple web page that can be changed using an entry in a text field. We'll ensure that the keyboard is configured properly to enter URLs and to submit requests. We'll also check to see if the site is even reachable before presenting the page, because if it's not, we'll present a content unavailable view. If we start to scroll, a scroll-to-top button appears that will quickly get us back to the top of the page. And we'll also look at creating a configuration screen to allow us to enable or disable things like backward and forward navigation, page magnification, web link previews, and text selection. So here's magnification enabled. We've enabled text selection as well, so we can press and hold to select text. If we've been on multiple pages, we can swipe from the edges to enable navigation back and forth. And if I find a link on a page, I can long press and get page previews displayed, just like in Safari. I do have a starter project for this video, and I encourage you to download it from the link in the description. There are two branches, and if you want to work along with me, download or clone the starter project branch. You can either clone the repository or download the zipped archive. I do recommend that you work along with me, but if you prefer, you can also download the completed source code from the completed branch. It's up to you. So let's start with the basics here and work up to a pretty powerful little web browser in this view. To do this, the first thing we'll need to do is to import WebKit. Now I can replace this comment here in my starter project's VStack with my own view with the new SwiftUI WebView. And we have two different options. We can supply a page, and that's what I'm going to cover in the next video, but we can also supply an optional URL. So what I want to do is to create a URL using the string argument and supply it with the Canadian Apple site, https://apple.ca. You might want to use apple.com or whatever the domain is for your country. And right away, the web view is created and presented in the preview. That was easy, but there are some issues. First, the view doesn't go down to the bottom of the screen. And secondly, the web view goes over the navigation bar. Neither of those are good looks. So to solve the first issue, I can apply an ignores safe area where I can specify edges, and I'll specify bottom. And that solves the first issue. The second issue is going to get resolved because we're going to create a text field above the web view that's going to allow us to enter a string that we can use for the string in formatting our URL. So first, let's create a state property for the string that we can use for our URL string. And we'll start with an empty string as default. Now, since the argument for the web view's URL is an optional URL, I'll want to create a state property that is an optional URL. And then I can form my URL using the string provided from the text field once I submit it. So I can replace that hard-coded URL with our URL. And since it's optional and none has been formed, the web page goes clear. So above the web view, let's create a text field. But I want to get fancy here and use the text label initializer. The text is still going to be bound to our URL string. But for our placeholder, we can actually use a text view. And I'm going to use string interpolation to create an image using the system name magnifying glass. And I'll follow that with another string, enter website. So this gives us a magnifying glass as our placeholder followed by that string. I'll set the text field style to a rounded border, and I'll add some padding. So now when we submit the text, we're going to want to update the URL. So we'll need to create an onSubmit method, and within the body or the action for that onSubmit, we'll assign to the URL property a URL formed by that string URL string. Now I can type right here in the text field and even in the simulator. And I'm seeing a problem right away that I don't like. And by default, the text field is auto-capitalized. But I'm going to override that though and create a fully formatted URL. And when I press return, the web page appears. But let's run the simulator and bring up the keyboard to see if there are any more issues. Again, as you can see, the first letter is capitalized, so I have to tap the Shift key to get lowercase. Then as I start to tap to enter the URL now for Apple, I really wish this keyboard was different, as it's quite awkward finding the right keys. Then, once I've entered it, for the Submit button, it's a return key. I wish this were something else that signified going to a website. It works though, but let me go to my website, and I wish there was a clear button here. When I type in the website URL, it's showing me a spell check because my website isn't a real word. And I don't want that to be spell checked. I don't want that curly underscore red. It still works though, but it's less than optimum. If the URL is not valid though, like when I remove the domain and try again, the view doesn't change, despite the fact that that's an invalid or an unreachable URL. So this needs to be fixed too. If you're enjoying this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment. And make sure you subscribe to my channel and enable notifications. You can also subscribe to my weekly newsletter. I'll leave a link in the description. The newsletter will provide you with more information about my latest videos, along with what's coming up, plus some extra bonus material. Now, if you enjoy my content and want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. If you really enjoy it, you can become a monthly subscriber and receive early access to all of my videos before they're released on YouTube. Some of these are really easy fixes, so let's start there. First, I'm going to change the submit level for the keyboard to the Go option. I can prevent spell checking on our URL by applying an auto-correction disabled method. I can prevent the first letter from being capitalized by setting auto-capitalization to none. And then I can improve the keyboard layout with a keyboard type of URL. Then, to add a clear button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enclose the text field in an H-stack. And then, as the second element in the H-stack, I want to check to see if anything is entered into the text field by checking if not URL string is empty. If it isn't, then we'll create a clear button. Well, for the action, it will be to set the URL string back to an empty string. And then for the label, well, we can make that an image using the system name xmark.circle.fill. And we can apply a foreground style of gray. Let's also add some horizontal padding to the H-stack. And then let's test this out in the simulator once more. When the keyboard is presented, I see that the first letter is no longer capitalized. And the keyboard is the URL style, so it makes it much easier to enter my URL. The Enter button is now the Go button, and when tapping it, the web page is presented. Because this text field is no longer empty, there's the clear button, and I can tap that to clear it. Now, when I enter my own website, I see that it's no longer spell checked. Well, this is great, but we can do better. I'm tired of typing https://, but I know that others might do that automatically. So what I want to do is to check that https:// is entered first, and if not, automatically prepend it. Also, when I clear the text field or enter an unreachable site or an invalid URL, I want to clear the web view and present some notification somehow. So let's fix both of these problems right now. In the starter project, I provided a simple static function with a namespace enum called checkURL that returns a bool. What that does is it accepts an URL as a string and then tries to form a URL from that string. If it can't, it returns false. Next, it sets the request method to fetch only the headers, as there's no need to fetch the entire page. We only want to know if the URL is reachable. So we try and await for the response for that request. If the response comes back with a status code between 200 and 399 inclusive, we can proceed so it returns true. Otherwise, we'll print the error and return false. So back in my view, I'm going to create a new function called checkAvailability that will call this function. But since that's an asynchronous function, we'll need this to be asynchronous as well. The first thing I can do here is to check to see if our URL string has that prefix of HTTPS. If it doesn't, I can append the given URL string to that prepended HTTPS://. Now, what I want to do is to track whether or not our site is reachable. So first, let me go back to the top and create a state property called isReachable and assume that it's not, as it would be when we first launch our app, because no URL is entered. So we'll set it to false. Back in the function then, we can assign to this state property the result of waiting for the call to the Reachability's checkURL function, passing in our URL string. Also, if it's reachable, we can now assign to the URL a new URL using the string URL string. If not, then we'll set the URL string back to an empty string. So how do we use this function? Well, let's use the isReachable state property to display a content unavailable view if isReachable is false. So we'll wrap the web view in an if clause and check if isReachable is true. And if it is, we'll present the website. But if not, we're going to create that new view. And we're just going to use a content unavailable view with a title and system image. And the title will be the string enter a valid URL. And the system image will be the link. So we'll need to call this function when we submit. And since it's asynchronous, we'll need to create a task unit of work in the onSubmit action. And then we can await the result of checkAvailability. And since we formed the URL string in that function, we can replace what we had there already. Well, I also want to do the same thing when I clear the text field. So let me do the same thing here in the clear button after we set the URL string back to an empty string. And then one final thing, when the view loads, I want to do that same check. So instead of an onAppear block, I'm going to create a task modifier here and await the result of checkAvailability. So let's check this out in the simulator, though this could be done in the preview too. I just want to make sure that it all works with the keyboard. When the view loads, we get that enter a valid URL view, the content unavailable view, because our URL string is empty. So let me just enter apple.com. No HTTP. When I tap the Go key, it automatically prepends the required scheme and displays the website. Let me clear the text field, and we see it presents the content unavailable view again. So let me type in the full URL now and go to Google. And this time, because I had the required scheme prefix, it accepts the URL, checks for availability, and presents the site. So let me remove the domain then and press return to submit. And we get this invalid URL. Great. Well, there are more methods that we can apply to a web view. So to discover this, I want to look at what I can do. I can option click on the web view to bring up the quick help. And I see that a web view is a scrollable view and behaves similarly to a scroll view. So we can use any scroll view methods that we want. But the only one I'm going to use here is this first one to restrict the scrolling of a website if the content doesn't require it. But there are a number of other methods that we can apply. So I want to demonstrate what effect these have. And because this is a testing project, I'm going to make the application of these methods interactive. Originally, I was going to let you create this view, but in the interest of time, I've included the view now as part of a starter project. It's simply a form with 4 toggles, and each one is bound to a property in a binding to a config object that has 4 Boolean properties. And when I present this view, it will be as a modal sheet, and I'll pass in an instance of the config object as the binding, and all 4 of the properties are initialized as false. And these 4 methods correspond to the 4 different methods that I want to demonstrate. We have a back and forward navigation. We can magnify the view. We can allow it to display preview links, and we can select text. So back in my web browser view then, let's create a state property to trigger the presentation of a modal sheet. Then we'll call that show config, and we'll initialize this as false. Next, we'll attach a toolbar to our view. And in the toolbar, we'll create a toolbar item with a primary action placement. Then I'm going to create a button using a label with configuration as the title, and I'll use the gear as the system image. And the action is simply going to be to toggle show config. So let's present that sheet then, where is presented is going to be bound to show config. Now the config view is going to need an instance of the config object. So back at the top, let's create that first as a state property. Now I can present the config view, passing in that instance of the config as a binding. And I don't need the full screen, so let's set a presentation detent of medium. And I'm also going to use something that I taught in a previous video in this series, and that's the new navigation transition. The match transition source is going to be the toolbar item. That's the source. And the ID will be some string that I'll specify as config. But I'm also going to need a namespace. So let me create that first, back at the top of our view. It's a namespace that I'll just call config space. The presented view then is the one that we can use a navigation transition. And that's zoom with the same ID and the same namespace. Now the sheet zooms out from the toolbar item. Nice. So how can we use this? First, I forgot that we can also apply a scroll bounds behavior to the web view based on size. So let's apply that to the web view. Now for those 4 different methods. If we apply a web view back forward navigation gesture method, I see that there are basically 2 options, disabled and enabled, And both are WebView back-forward navigation gesture behavior types. So I can use the config's nav actions property as a ternary check and set it to enabled if it's true or disabled if false. I can do the same thing for magnification. It has enabled and disabled both as magnification gesture behaviors. So again, I can use the config's magnification property in the same way as a ternary check to enable or disable that option. Next is a web link previews, and it's a link preview behavior. So again, I'm going to use the config, this time the link previews as our ternary check, and that's how we'll enable that or disable that availability. And then the last one is the WebView text selection, but this one's not as straightforward. Text selectability has enabled and disabled as well, but the disabled type is disability text selectability, while the enabled type is enabled text selectability. So we can't use a ternary check here to present the different types. So what I'm going to do quickly is to create a view modifier to make this easier for us. So down at the bottom of this view, I'm just going to create a WebView text selection modifier. That is a view modifier. And all view modifiers require a body function, and that's going to provide us with content that we can work with. So if I can pass in that Boolean property from our config into this view, I can use that to apply a different web text selection choice. So I'm going to wrap this here now in an if clause, and I'll get content now in both. In the true case, I'm going to use the web text selection as enabled. And then in the false case, I'll use web text selection as disabled. And then to make this more Swifty, I'm going to create an extension to the view. And then I can create a function using exactly the same name as our WebView modifier, but I'm going to use a different argument, namely our Boolean text selection property, and it will return some view. I can then apply our view modifier using the WebView text selection modifier, passing in that text selection. So now the modifier can be used on our web view, but I'll just pass in the configurations text selection. So let me test this out in the preview. I'm going to go to the Apple site. I can tap on the Learn More link to go to another page, but there are no back buttons in the URL web view, and it doesn't give us that by default. But I might be able to swipe to get back, but I can't unless I go to my config view and turn that on. As soon as I do that, I can swipe back and forth for navigation. I'd like to zoom in on this text. Unfortunately, I can't. However, I can enable that option too. Now look at this link here. I can long press and nothing happens. But if I go back to our configuration and enable link previews, I can long press and get them in my view. And finally, if I see some text that I want to copy, right now I can't select them. So let me go back and turn that on to enable it. Now, if I return to my view and find some text, I can long press and copy it. Now, I believe if we didn't add any of these modifiers to our view, we'd find that all of those are enabled by default. So that must be the automatic setting. However, as you see, you have the ability to control those by applying those modifiers. Now, this is a pretty long video, but I want to go over one more thing that is possible with the web view. And that's the ability to add a button that will allow us to scroll back to the top if we've scrolled down on our website. So if you're still interested, stick with me. So let me option click on that web view once more to bring up that quick help. And the method that I want to take a look at is the web view on scroll geometry change method. Let me drill down. And it's going to allow me to add an action to be performed when a scroll geometry changes. So what is a scroll geometry? Well, let's drill down on that. And it has all of these instance properties. And the one that I'm interested in is the content offset, which is a CG point. But specifically, I want the Y offset because I want to be able to use that to create a button that will allow me to scroll to the top. And that value is a CG float. But I only want it to appear if I have scrolled. So let's return to the web view now. And I'm going to set the default scroll anchor to top. And then I can track the web view scroll position. But I'm going to need a binding to a scroll position object instance. So I'm going to create a state property for that. And I'll just call it scroll position. And that's what I'm going to use for our binding. Now we can use that WebView onScroll geometry change method. And it's going to need a type. And that's the type of thing that we're observing. And that's a Y offset that we want to track, which is a CG float. So we'll use cgfloat.self. And then this will give us the geometry object. And the instance that we want is the geometry content offset of Y. And that's the CG float type. So once we are observing that, the changes, what we can do then in the action is to determine whether or not we have scrolled from the top, which means that value is greater than 0. And that's when we're going to want to present our scroll to top button. So this gives us the old and the new value. I'm only interested in the new value if it's greater than 0. So I'll create a Boolean value for that, and we're going to call that show scroll to top button. And since we start at the default being the top, we'll initialize this as false. The action then is that the value of the show scroll to top button's Boolean will depend on whether or not the new value is greater than 0. If it is, then it's true. If not, it'll be false. So where do we want to display this button? Well, why not at the bottom in a safe area inset where our fingers are? Let's also align it to the trailing edge. This will be conditional. We only want to display it if show scroll to top button is true. So I'm going to use an image with an on-tap gesture. The image will be the one that uses the system name arrow.up. I'm going to set the font to a system size of 36. I'll apply a frame with a width of 60 and a height of 60. Then I'm going to add a glass effect of regular that will be interactive. I've covered this in previous videos. And I'm going to add some padding. Then I can create an on-tap gesture. And the action will be done with animation, which will simply be to tell the scroll position to scroll to the top edge. And one more thing, if we submit another site and it fails to reach it, or if we clear the text field, the checkability function is called. So if it's not reachable, I want to make sure to set the show scroll to top button to false because we'll be displaying the content unavailable view. Let's try this out. Let me go to the Apple site. No button is displayed at the bottom until I scroll. And then tapping the button scrolls the view to the top. Let me go to another site like Google. The button disappears again because we're at the top. But when I scroll, it appears again. If I clear the field, the content unavailable view appears and the button's gone. Great. We're done with this WebView initializer. We've pretty much maxed out what it can do, but there are a number of limitations here. So Apple has given us another initializer that I'm going to cover in the next video that can really improve on things. I hope you've enjoyed this video and can use what you've learned so far going forward in your own projects. So thanks for watching. If you found this tutorial helpful, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment. You can subscribe to my channel to get notifications of new videos. And remember that you can also download my YouTube channel listing app for free and quick access to all of my 350 plus YouTube videos. A link's in the description. And also remember I have a full SwiftUI course available on my Teachable site where you learn how to build a fun multi-targeted app.